Hello, everybody. This is Sean, your favorite intern with the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. And as of recording this message, Andrew is actually overseas in Madrid for a very special Edgar Allan Poe conference. So that is exactly why you guys are getting a super spooky, bloody, haunty, gothic episode today. Andrew and Dr. Amy Armiento get into all things Poe, Wednesday Addams, The Haunting of Hill House. This is all things for the goth geeks and the horror nerds. This is it. So you guys enjoy, strap in. You're gonna get some goosebumps. So be on the lookout. So enjoy this episode. You guys know the drill. We'll see you at the end. Thank you so much for listening.
What is it for you about the Addams family? Like, I know you say you kind of have a kinship to Wednesday. So, like, if you want to unpack that here on the show.
Right, right. So I'm not quite old enough to have grown up when the show first came out on television,
Yeah.
but it was in syndication when I was growing up. So, I remember that show. And then of course it's had its revisions, and now here we are with the series Wednesday. And I said to you that I have a lot, I feel like I identify with Wednesday in a lot of ways.
Hi, this is Dr. Andrew Rimby, the host of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, an arts and culture podcast. Thank you for listening. I want to just remind you all that if you're not following us on social media, please do. It's always nice to interact with you all, and I'm always posting clips from the podcast, information about our free book club that's on Zoom, and all other kinds of exciting events, and a lot of literary posts. So Instagram is at Ivory Tower Boiler Room, and so is our Facebook. We have a LinkedIn, a YouTube channel where you might be watching us now. So hi, there's a video episode on YouTube. And our TikTok is actually my name. It's at Dr. Rimby. And Patreon is where you can find all the just uncensored, no ad episodes. It's patreon.com/ Ivory Tower Boiler Room. There's usually some kind of deal going on, and you can try it out for a few days for free if you just want to see what gets posted there. And if you're listening on Apple, please leave us a review. It means a lot. If you're listening on Spotify, make sure you're following us. And I hope you all just enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby. Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. And I have been so meaning to talk with the following guest who, anytime I have seen her in person, which might have only been one. No, I think it's twice, but I think it's twice. Uh, Amy Branam Armiento is an amazing, accomplished Dr. Amy Branam Armiento, such an accomplished Gothic literary scholar, specifically with all things Edgar Allan Poe. I always have loved chatting with her, and I knew I had to have her on the podcast. So, what better way to get her on the podcast but to talk about a collected essay collection that she edited called More Than Love, The Enduring Fascination with Edgar Allan Poe. And Poe is always everywhere all at once. Meg Flanagan was obsessed with him with his Fall of the House of Usher series. I feel like the new show Wednesday has a lot of Poe aesthetic to it. So I want to introduce you to Amy. She's a professor of English at Frostburg State University, an immediate past president of the Poe Studies Association, which, if you don't know about them, look up the Poe Studies Association as you're listening. They're incredible. She holds a PhD in English from Marquette University. Many of her publications and lectures focus on the treatment of women in 19th century literary works, including her other co-edited book called Poe and Women: Recognition and Revision. So, welcome to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, Amy.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, can you trace back when Edgar Allan Poe first entered Amy Branam Armiento's life? Like when did that happen to you in your life journey?
Right, right. So back when I was still just Amy Branham. Um, yeah, so It's interesting because in the edited collection, and I will also shamelessly hold it up occasionally,
Yeah.
maybe parade it around.
Yeah.
But I was reading people's stories about how they first encountered Edgar Allan Poe, and for many people, it was in school or it was on the screen, whether television or film. And I was like, no, I don't. I'm sure I read him in school, but I don't have a memory of reading him in school. My memories are of reading him in my bedroom growing up. I came across a book of poetry, and nothing famous or that's probably still printed today, that my parents had on the shelf behind our piano, and it had the raven in it. So I read that poem, and I still have that book. And I remember reading The Telltale Heart when I was pretty young, but again, I was reading it in a collection. So many of us have these purported and complete collections of Edgar Allan Poe. They aren't usually complete. And I had one of those, and I just read his stories on my own. And um and and just sort of didn't, I mean, I liked him, but I didn't necessarily love him or think I would dedicate my scholarship to him when I was younger. I was really interested in some other writers who were influenced by him, but I didn't know that yet.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because I feel like, see, my memory with Poe is middle school. I know we read The Telltale Heart, The Masque of the Red Death, The Black Cat, The Pit and the Pendulum. We basically covered like so many of his short stories. And I don't know if that's like because my teacher was obsessed with Poe. I think maybe recently got their master's in American literature, so wanted to just like give us everything on their syllabus, which I was happy about. Maybe the other students in the class, I'm not sure. But I think Poe, his stories though do speak to middle schoolers or even a younger audience. Like, what for you, Amy, is it about Poe's writing, specifically his short stories, that you can have both such a young audience and an adult audience?
Right, right. I think it's interesting that we make those distinctions, right? Of course we do. We have YA readings and we have adult readings. And it's interesting though, because I feel like a lot of the concerns I would have around junior high school for me were things about becoming an adult, right? So things
Mhm.
you had to start worrying about, like the people in your life who you would like to think are protecting you and care about you, but that wasn't obviously true for everybody, that there could be people who were very unsafe in your household, right? And thinking about that. And I think as a young woman, a girl going into a young womanhood, reading some of his stories, like The Fall of the House of Usher, or Ligeia, or Morella eventually, or Berenice, where you're reading these stories and you're like thinking, oh, this is not a safe world for women. How they could be so easily attacked by the person who purports to love them, or at least is going to, because we know in some of the stories the narrators say they do not love their spouses, but are supposed to be a companion at the very least, right? Shouldn't be a threat to them. And starting to have that awareness, at the same time you realize I'm growing up when Jenny Jones and Jerry Springer and all these talk shows are happening, right? And the X-Files, trust no one, and you're reading all these stories where it's like, oh yeah, trust no one, and especially your romantic partner maybe, right? So I think in that way, um Poe has some quite mature themes, but it's almost tantalizing for those of us who are in those prepubescent into puberty years of like, oh, this is what adults know. This is adult information. I need to take it in. It's a little bit tantalizing, I think. But of course, it's still relevant as we get older because it has
Mm.
to do with what it means to be an adult in a relationship in many of his stories. And sadly, some of those stories just are not um, that imaginative for people's experiences. So if you
Yeah.
happen to relate to that, or you feel like in some way, if you find yourself in the kind of dangerous relationship, you can sort of prepare yourself maybe for some signs. I don't know. It sort of, I think, crosses into true crime, that fascination many people, especially women, have with, it's not that you're drawn to the sensationalist part so much. It's more like I need to be aware of signs that something could go awry in my life and be prepared for that.
Yeah, well, and I feel like without Poe, we would not have so many interesting horror authors. Like I'm thinking of Stephen King specifically, but I mean,
Yes.
Poe created this really laying bare the sociopathic mind without like really the science around the sociopath in
Mhm.
psychology at the time. And I think that he just plays around with such an interesting blend of mythology meets the sociopath meets like he's always kind of intersecting different types of themes, and I think that's what keeps me coming back is I love what he's doing where he's always inverting something. He's always subverting some traditional idea. And like for you, Amy, who do you think his inheritors are? Like, are there authors or even, filmmakers that you think without Poe, we would not have really had their creative voice out there?
Right. Well, many of them have said as much, right? It's of course it's great to mention Stephen King. I'm glad you brought him up. He was who I was reading more when I was younger, and then
Mhm.
he's pointing. If he doesn't outright allude to Poe, there are also hints to Poe and his works. And so I was reading a lot of Stephen King. I was reading a lot of Anne Rice as well
Mm.
when I was younger. And then I was reading some older works because I love the 19th century. So I was reading Thomas Hardy, late 19th century writer, and then I actually got to Poe, I think, most directly through Lord Byron. That Lord Byron to this
Oh,
day is
wow.
my first love. And we know, if you know anything about Poe's biography, we know that he modeled himself on Lord Byron, admired Lord Byron quite a bit. And so, I love Lord Byron. I love Anne Radcliffe. I love Monk
Mhm.
Lewis. Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Horace Walpole. How fun! The Castle of Otranto. I'm reading Brockton Brown. I reread Brockton Brown. I just taught Brockton Brown's Wieland. Washington Irving, Hawthorne, all of them. I just once I found King and Rice, and they sort of were guiding me back to Poe and then Byron Ford. It's like I kind of met in the middle and got back to Poe with the precursors of the Gothic, or the founders of the Gothic, I should say. And then the inheritors, more the contemporary writers, I got back to Poe in the middle, who really refined it for the US. So yeah. For film, Hitchcock, of course. I love Hitchcock, and he's said that Poe's an influence on him. So great fun there. And then you mentioned Flanagan. It's been really fun to watch the different series Mike Flanagan has created. So
Yeah, I am so anticipatory about his Carrie series. I want the Carrie series now. I like just want to see what it's gonna look like.
yeah, what he's
But
gonna do it. Well, I think it's gonna be particularly graphic, even more than
mhm.
we saw in the earlier film, because he does like some graphic violence.
Yeah, yeah. I literally just had a recording that now has just come out because you're right after her, but her name is Kirsten White, and she wrote a novel called Lucy Undying that just came out, and it's a retelling of Dracula. And we were talking about what Midnight Mass does with the vampire lore and the cult like thinking. And I do think like we can't talk about Poe without talking about how Gothic literature taps into culture anxieties. And like, I'm curious, Amy, like, especially when you're teaching Poe or any of the authors you've mentioned, how do students, like, how do you get the 2025, the Gen Z mind invested? Because it's something I'm always curious about. Like, what do you bring in or what do you do to, like, make that 19th century literature come alive for your students?
Right. Right. Always a challenge, right? We have a little bit of an advantage with Poe because thanks to the middle school and high school teachers, they've had some exposure to him usually, and they're excited about if maybe that's me being a little delusional. They're excited. But I tell my students that feed the delusion. You want to be here. But if they're not excited, they're at least familiar with Poe. And so that's an advantage when I teach him. But during COVID, I went ahead and put the Masque of the Red Death on the syllabus because it was like, let's go ahead and talk about pandemic, shall we? And it was funny because something that seemed so removed and other times I taught it before we had the COVID-19 pandemic, where you sort of have this prince who's removed himself and all these rich people from everyone else, and they're having this party. I'm simplifying, but and everyone else is sort of left to suffer. Took on a whole new meaning when we were going through the lockdown, right? And
Mhm.
just actually watching people in power thinking, oh, we don't have to follow the rules. We can hang out together. And it was just amazing. It just like taught itself at that point. And it's like, yes, it's still relevant. I like to teach Morella. I just taught Morella earlier today in my introduction to literature class. I like to teach that story because uh, it's it's a spooky story in some ways. The baptism becomes an exorcism, so to speak, which is fun. We're in October. Most of them would not have read the story before, but it's also an interesting way to talk about what if this story isn't actually supernatural. What maybe did this narrator do to his daughter? And
Mm.
having these conversations again with this dysfunctional family, I think is kind of interesting to have with students. They can certainly relate to that. And so I think for me, a lot of it is the power dynamics that you see between men and women in the stories, how at times the women seem to have power and at times the men seem to have power. But then, like you mentioned earlier, there's often in the horror stories anyway, something else going on, whether that's a mental illness or that's coded as something supernatural, or if it's addiction, like the black cat, right? So, in those ways, the students find a lot that relate to their own lives. And, think about how can I tell a story about reality, but sort of divorce it from reality. So maybe it's not as scary. I guess that's
Yeah.
arguable, but yeah.
Well, if only I could be a fly on your wall, Amy, in the classroom, because it's fascinating the way that you approach teaching. I think it's so powerful. I think that it makes me think of how Mike Flanagan has really tapped into mental health when it comes to horror. And like what I love about the Haunting of Hill House series, it's probably my favorite um Gothic series I've seen, maybe
Okay.
ever. I'm not sure.
Yep.
I'd have to think about my oeuvre, but like I love what he does with thinking about trauma and specifically like grief and loss and how, you could be haunted by the ghostly specter and like is it there? Is it not? It doesn't really matter because this person is suffering with trauma and they haven't fully unpacked it. So it's like the haunting and the ghostly apparitions are tied to their grief. And I think like that is what makes the gothic and horror so always timely is we all have psychological moments where we haven't fully resolved certain anxieties or you know concerns and I don't know if you feel the same way but I do feel like there's such an always timely message in these texts that you know the modern day those inspired by Poe and others have turned like their tails on their head, like have made them more into these psychologically rich
Mhm.
texts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. Yeah, yeah. And also not only what this unprocessed trauma for the person, the individual, but then how by not having processed that trauma, they are now hurting those around them,
Mm.
right? So,
Well,
mm.
yeah, you made me rethink about Carrie. It's like, is Carrie's telekinesis actually an imaginative trauma response to her religious zealot mother who is literally physically and verbally abusing her on a daily basis? And then she's getting abuse from her classmates. I mean, how horrible that she can't get away from this abuse. Like she's constantly being subjected. I don't know. Carrie to me is such a fascinating character study. Like I think
Yeah,
she's just it's a fascinating text. It's probably it was my like first Stephen King novel and it will always be my favorite Stephen King novel.
same. It's same for me. Yeah, it's my favorite Stephen King novel by far. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So like how do you find the current selection of horror films? And do you feel like there's an interesting theme going on? Are you drawn more to horror films or horror literature? Like, do you make like a distinction of what you consume? Now that the spring semester is here, I am so excited to let you all know about a publisher, an independent publisher that's celebrating 40 years of great books called Broadview Press. I love Broadview Press. I have so many of their editions of classic literature like Wuthering Heights, which is coming out soon, and it's our book club choice. And they have so many academic books for instructors and for students and the general public. So I've had so many exciting guests on, from guests talking about The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, guests talking about vampire literature, horror literature. I'm looking at you, Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock, whose book actually just came out called Horror Theory. Look it up. And I cannot wait because I have two exciting guests coming on soon. And I've recorded their episodes, so I know that it's going to be such an interesting conversation. The first is Rachel Tukalski, who wrote a book called Writing on Fire, a fierce yet friendly guide to writing humanities essays in college. I've used excerpts of it for my Writing 2 course at Montclair. It has gone over so well. I just love what Rachel does. And we get into this in our episode about this metaphor about writing on fire, like how that's a great way to think about free flowing, brainstorming, creative ideas, and getting into that flow state, which, as Rachel explains, happens not just in writing, but in many other avenues. And then the other guest that I have on is David Starkey, who wrote a book called Academic Writing Now, a brief guide for busy students. It is designed to cover the basics of a college writing course in a concise, student-friendly format. Each chapter concentrates on a crucial element of composing an academic essay and is capable of being read in a single sitting, which, for a generation, myself included, I think all of us now, just consumed by digital media or just this attention grabbing technology, reading in a single sitting is definitely a plus. So head to Broadview Press, use the promo code Ivory Tower, and you'll get 20% off every single book in their collection. There's also a really cool digital library collection they have. So if you're a librarian, take a look at that. Message me. If you're a librarian, I'd be happy to show you what that new collection looks like. And I hope you all enjoy your reading. It may be freezing here in the Northeast, but when I received my copy of the Gay and Lesbian Review, it warmed me up instantly. Their new issue is all about kink culture. Let me explain a little. I'm going to read what Jeremy C. Fox, the managing editor, has to say about this issue. He says this issue marks a bit of a departure for the Gay and Lesbian Review as we crack open the bedroom door to explore the practices and paraphilias that interest or obsess some LGBT people and the roots of their appeal. Several feature articles delve deeply into why certain kinks turn some of us on, and whether we can discern historical and aesthetic rationales behind these fixations. This magazine features articles such as The Power of the Foot. Oh, yeah, they're going there with foot kinks. Maplethorpe's Gift to America, Reclaiming the Sacred Dungeon. Tumblr was a gateway to kink, and Cruising with Boyd McDonnell. You definitely want to get your hands on the kink issue here. I have an exclusive promo code that those at the Gay and Lesbian Review have granted to you all. It is ITBR Choice. Enter it when you check out on the glreview.org and you will get a free issue of the magazine. I hope you all enjoy your reading, and it'll definitely keep you nice and cozy.
I do. I'm definitely a reader first before I'm watching things on TV or on film. I've and I am really picky about my horror films because horror, implies gruesome graphic imagery, but I don't like a lot of gruesome graphic imagery. So it's easier for me to read it than it is to watch it. Although sometimes it's hard for me to read it too, because I have quite an imagination. But yeah, so I tend to turn to books more than film or series. But I love things that film can do, like that. I think when we read, especially as readers today, we read quickly through the mood setting parts of Gothic works or horror works. And I think film has a really great advantage in that it can take, obviously it has the visual advantage because we're looking at the screen, but the way it can deal with shadows and light, I think that's really great. Ambient effects, storms, right? Those kinds of things that are often important to the Gothic and horror films. But also, I find myself really fascinated with how film uses sound. And I don't mean like soundtracks and Foley, kinds of things, but silences in particular, I think is really important. And how I like a slower paced film where, and it's kind of weird to say this, I think, but I'm going to bring up Corman's films that starred Vincent Price, those adaptations of Poe. But I think when you watch or rewatch some of those films, like I just rewatched The Raven, they did a screening of it at Poe Fest, and yes, it's very campy for sure. But you go back and you watch how Vincent Price acts, and he's very subtle at times, and it's in the gestures, it's in the facial expressions, it's in the slower paced delivery of lines versus sometimes when he speeds up, and he knows the humor, and I like my horror to have some dark humor in it. So and Poe has that. But I still think, for me, the most recent film that I think was done really well, had a coherent message, because I need a good tight narrative, and horror films are not always known for that. Get Out is still one of my favorites. Jordan Peele's Get Out. I just think that's a great film. And I'm sure that's, he doesn't need me to say that, but it's a great
Oh,
film. And I
it's so
know,
incredible. Yeah.
yeah, and really enjoyed the remake of Nosferatu.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll still, no one can top Max Shrek, but yeah. So um yeah, but yeah, so for me, uh I want, I think for me, when we talk film, I'm more interested, and Poe does it too, I'm more interested in the suspense and maybe the psychological thriller aspect of horror. I don't need the carnage. So yeah.
Yeah, you're not really a Terrifier fan. You're more
Yes.
like a Sixth Sense fan.
Yes, correct. Yeah, for
Okay.
sure.
Yeah, well, and
How
it's
about
so
you? What
interesting.
movies? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry.
No, no, no. I was just gonna say it's so interesting you mentioned Vincent Price because my fiance actually had the House of Wax, and I've seen the remake multiple times, but I've never seen the original. And I like had fallen asleep, and I wake up to Vincent Price in the House of Wax, and I was like, Wait, what's happened? But it was so interesting because he has such a presence, you're right. And like I even remember he plays the magic mirror in Fairy Tale Theater with Vanessa Redgrave, which you've seen that? Okay.
Seen Fairy Tale Theater. Yeah.
Oh, so good. And Vanessa Redgrave, I want to watch the film she was in, The Devils. Do you
I
know
haven't
about
seen
this film? Okay,
I haven't seen it.
she plays like a possessed nun in the medieval period. It is she's like trying to get with priests. It's wild. Like I need to try to find it, but if I feel like it was definitely heavily censored by the
Oh,
Catholic Church, probably. But
wonder why. Yeah.
and
Yes.
but I feel like with Vincent Price, he just has this like real presence of um tapping into storytelling. Like he really knows the art of gripping the audience. And
Yeah.
you're right, it can be very campy, the Poe
Mhm.
remakes, but it's also, you know, he is able to get to the psychological depth, which
Yeah.
can be tough. Like it can be tough to try to, I feel, adapt a Poe story without it just seeming um, over the top. Like to actually
Right.
try to make these characters human because they are archetypal characters in a way, like mythology.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. And even when the text, like the Raven is not really about the Raven. It's not the greatest dramatization of that work in
Yeah.
terms of faithfulness. There's still, um, I feel when I watch it, Vincent Price understands where it's dovetailing with the actual work, where it's departing and how they're having
Mm.
fun with it. And like I don't get the sense that he doesn't understand the original works. So I appreciate that quite a bit.
Well, so how did you like Crimson Peak? Because that was very like American Gothic in
I
its
haven't seen
setting.
that. Yeah, I don't know it.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
No. So yeah, tell me about it. Crimson
Well,
Peak?
it has
Mhm.
like a Fall of the House of Usher type narrative without it being a faithful adaptation. It's more like what I would say is
Oh,
like a Poe aesthetic where it takes place with Jessica Chastain and it's the I think it's in America, but it's like a haunted house, but the 19th century. So it does have this like, oh, it could be the fall of the House of Usher. But yeah, it's like a cursed family. It's interesting. I think it's well done. I think it's like the eccentricities of like the family. Um, so I recommend it, definitely.
oh, definitely. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
gonna
yeah,
watch that.
yeah. Well, and then I know you're a huge, which you would have loved. I went to see Charles Adams' hometown, Westfield, near me in Jersey, and saw the house that inspired him to like write the Adams Family. And, what is it for you about the Adams Family? Like, I know you say you kind of have a kinship to Wednesday. So, like, if you want to unpack that here on the show.
Right, right. So I'm not quite old enough to have grown up when the show first came out on television,
Yeah.
but it was in syndication when I was growing up. So, I remember that show. And then of course it's had its revisions, and now here we are with the series Wednesday. And I said to you, that I have a lot. I feel like I identify with Wednesday in a lot of ways. I mean, obviously I like to wear black. So you have the basic thing there. Um, but just as a she reminds me a lot of myself as a teenager. So antisocial in a lot of ways. Played music. I also played music. I didn't play the cello though. I did piano and flute. I also I really enjoyed the time I had to myself. So I like that about her. She's her aversion to devices that connect her to other people, that sort of
Mhm.
same thing. I like that. That I relate to even more now than I did when I was a teenager. Um, she's very much present in her moment. She's aware of what's going on around her. She's reading people. And I feel like maybe I don't do that very well, but I try to do that, know what's going on around me. Those who have watched the series, there's this recurring shtick where she has an editor, she's sending her novel and they keep wanting her to make edits. And she's like, I'm not doing that. That reluctance to edit. Definitely, I have that now in my later life, but all along, very stubborn. I said it the way I wanted to, the way it needed to be. That's very much part of my personality. But then I like she has like some surprising whimsical sides. Like she has her dance that she does, and things like that. So, and she loves to quote other writers. Although I was upset because in the second season there's a misattribution to Poe. And I thought, oh no, don't do that. There's a quote, I don't believe in ghosts, but they have been chasing me my whole life. He did not say or write that anywhere. And she says, Poe did this. Like, no, no. So, but that's for those of us who really want to nitpick at the series. But yeah, I really like a lot of things about her and how she's navigating this world that wants to pull her out of herself, right? And I think that's important because many of us who maybe tend to gravitate toward the dark side of literature, dark side of film, the dark side of even human nature. And not that we ourselves are evil or dark, but we distrust other human beings. The one thing I like about that the series Wednesday is that you have a lot of people who are kind and who want to be her friend and want to draw her out and want her to trust. And and of course it's designed for, it feels anyway like it's designed for a younger audience, and it's trying to get some of those messages across, which I do appreciate because I didn't feel that way when I was around that age. Probably needed more of that messaging myself. So
Well,
yeah.
and I think it's fascinating that Wednesday has drawn such a huge fan base response with the merch and the marketing, and it seems like it's no it's no longer as much of a stigma. Like I remember growing up that like Hot Topic was kind of like, oh, someone's going to Hot Topic, like, oh, they're not part of the preppy crowd. Where like now it kind of
Right.
just seems like, oh, goth fashion, that's like an aesthetic to take on. Like so
Correct.
it
Mhm.
seems like it's more in vogue now to be goth than it was like when in
Yeah.
previous generations.
Yeah, it's funny to use their word. It's more like a normie thing to do, even though they're outcasts, so to speak, right? It's funny to see that. Well, once it's commercialized into these chains, and then yeah, and then we're in their world, so of course it's normalized to be a goth, so to speak. Yeah, it is fascinating to see that evolution. We didn't really have. Oh, and to see. Right, it's so fun to see. It's a Tim Burton project. He's directing
Mm.
quite a few of the episodes, so that's going to be gold if he's touching it. And I feel, and then to have some of these really amazing actors involved. I love Luis Guzman as
Mm.
Gomez Adams. I think he's great, and Catherine Zeta-Jones is wonderful as Morticia. And then we're getting these cameos. Steve Buscemi right now is Principal
Yeah.
Dort, in the second season. But it is funny too because you see someone like Steve Buscemi, and I don't want to spoil the series, but I'm like the way he's portrayed at first, you're like, well, he's got to be a bad guy, right? It's but I won't say anything. But it's just kind of interesting who comes in, and we have these expectations for them. But yeah, it's a bittersweet thing. I think as someone who grew up more, um, you know, like and isolated more, whether by design, by choice, or not always did you want to be seen that way as weird or other, right?
Mhm.
That now it's like a cool thing, or it's not as stigmatized, or there aren't all those judgments on
Mm.
kids who look a certain way, right? I mean, we still have some of it. We definitely still have some of it, but it's just different now. So that's probably
Yeah.
good. It's probably good.
Yeah. Well, I'm about to see Beetlejuice on Broadway, so I'm so excited
Oh,
because I didn't
fun.
see it when it first came. And I love so many people. have put down Beetlejuice, but I actually really liked it. I don't know if it's because others. I thought it was actually a pretty good sequel. I'm not sure though. How do you weigh in on Beetlejuice,
Yeah,
Amy, this sequel?
I'm in and out of that one because I will watch it, and then the Danny DeVito character when he gets
Oh,
murdered, I have trouble getting past that part. We're back to the gruesome stuff and the imagination of mine that takes over. But I really like the idea of bringing back some of the original cast members. Of course, it is. I do feel old when I see Winona Ryder because she's aging, and so you have that. But yeah, I was very pleased with that sequel as well. So I don't know, it's just you can't please everyone, right?
no,
So
no.
but I
But
I
you're
definitely
right.
enjoyed it.
I feel
Yeah.
like, having Lydia, having um, you know,
I can't remember Deal
what's
no
the
Delia, the mom?
Delia,
Oh sorry.
Delia, thank you. Yes, yes,
Yeah,
Delia.
okay. I
Like
can't believe I
having
pulled that one up. So
Yeah,
yeah.
but having Lydia, having Delia, like
Mhm,
having like the next generation with Jenna Ortega,
mhm.
I think worked really well. And yeah, I mean, is the Monica Belushi character necessary? I don't know. But it was like very aesthetically interesting. I think it's like Tim Burton playing around with the musicality, the scenery. Like I find it more interesting in terms of the artwork, like the art quality of it. And like not necessarily the narrative as much. I think Tim Burton, though, he is more of an atmospheric director. It's about what he creates, right? Which kind of gets us into the Gothic. I mean, like in your opinion, Amy, what is the difference between, say, a Gothic atmosphere and a horror atmosphere?
Yeah. Well, I think they're very close, right? I mean, so the I, the Gothic to me is definitely the enclosed space, right?
Mm,
So for whatever reason you're trapped somewhere, right? And trapped can take many meanings, but sometimes you're actually confined to the space, or you're seeking shelter from a storm and you pick the wrong place, that kind of thing. So I feel like the horror film has really kept that, right? You got to get somebody, for the most part. I mean, Friday the 13th, they're outside a lot, but they're still confined to that camp for the most part. So you're right, there's a place that you are trapped in or you're vulnerable in. And so for me, the Gothic and the horror, um, I guess for me, the Gothic has more maybe a political message, something about power dynamics that
mm,
may or may not happen in horror or horror films in particular, although they are pretty good at that, I think, when we look at horror films, generally speaking, about who's oppressed, who's the oppressor, who's the monster. I love the play that we see right now in film and novels about what we mean by monster.
mm,
But yeah, I think for me, that's why I would say Get Out is such a successful film for me, because it has such a clear, important message, a commentary, if you will, on race relations in the United States. It's pulling from history, but also in present day, right? I feel like the Gothic has that deeper meaning that maybe horror doesn't always have. It's
mm.
and
No,
it's not a
thank you.
it's not a clear distinction, but that's where I would start, I guess.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
thank you for that, Amy. That was really
Yeah.
helpful. And I think that, you know, as and I told you this would fly by and it did, is because I could just talk with you all the, you know, I could talk to you about every text. I think that something I'm curious about is okay, we're diehard Gothic literature fans, we're even diehard 19th century fans, but like a question I just keep coming back to, and I think it's just because of the times we're in, but people were asking this even in the 19th century is like why teach these texts, right? Like what do we learn from say reading Edgar Allan Poe? Like what do you feel like happens? Like, where are we heading when it comes to, say, Poe studies? Like, what concerns are seeming to be the most urgent in scholarship? If you like can kind of give your soothsayer type of crystal ball.
Are you a fan of classic Hollywood movies?
Are you a fan of queer cinema?
Then do we have the podcast for you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christian Garcia.
And I'm Luke Delmar.
And we are your hosts of That Old Gay Classic Cinema, where we take a look at some of the greatest films of all time and analyze them through a queer theoretical lens.
Let's be honest. LGBTQIA+ people have been a part of Hollywood since its inception, and this podcast celebrates those artists and entertainers of yesteryear while also taking a closer look at the queer-coded characters and stories in classic Hollywood films long before queer representation entered the mainstream.
So follow us down the road of classic cinema as we give you a guide to some of the films that touched our hearts, brains, and even gave us courage to be ourselves.
You can listen to That Old Gay Classic Cinema wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok.
All right, listeners, we're ready for our close-up.
Welcome to Severed, a podcast suite dropping new episodes every Monday. Severed True Crime and Severed Paranormal episodes deep dive into murder, mysteries, and the otherworldly in a concise format. A 7-minute story to frame the case with thoughtful analysis and our usual banter.
We sometimes find the lighter side of darker cases. We offer 3 spin-off shows, Severed Strange Stories, Severed Haunted You, and Severed Serial Killers that highlight the unusual to lighthearted topics from the digital dumpsters of true crime, haunted universities, and the minds of madness like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer.
We are your co-hosts. I'm Harry Chambers.
And I'm Drew Hudson. Listen on all major podcast platforms, including Rogue Media Network and Radio Garden State. Follow us on Instagram at severed_podcast.
Atmospheric reading here.
Some kind of conduit to the future here. But yeah, well, I think Poe studies specifically, but just Gothic generally, I think what it does is underscore a through line in human nature, right? That we really haven't changed all that much. We like to think we've evolved quite a bit from century to century, but really human nature it's kind of the same in a lot of ways. And what I really like is the shift in post studies and in horror, especially the books that I'm reading, these Gothic horror stories, that we're getting voices that are not voices that traditionally held political power, right? Had their voice heard in the past. So I'm thinking here of like a Silvia Moreno Garcia, Mexican Gothic, or I really love the novels of Isabel Cañas, really loving her work. Then we have Victor Laval, we have Stephen Graham Jones, just all these writers who, like I mentioned earlier, they're really thinking about, at least as I see it, what we mean by monster and how that changes depending on whose perspective the story is told from, right? Which we saw way back with Frankenstein, right? Frankenstein's monster, but really the monster is Victor. Victor Frankenstein is the real problem, right? And what has he done to the creature? And so we have the sympathetic creature, and I really think that what the future is doing, or I hope will continue to do, is allowing space for these voices, for these stories, and for like change of the filter, right? A change of the perspective, move the lens a little bit and look at the same set of events through a different angle, a different interpretation, and it just opens up so much. You know, who was the victim here actually? Who was the oppressor here actually, right? And I hope that what we see is more of and this might be too political, but in the sense of political parties, but I would like to see the Gothic do more of applying Gothic conventions to reading our current political moment in the US,
Hmm.
right? With confinement and being snatched from the street and then detained, right? Like a pit in the pendulum kind of situation, and you're monitored, you're surveyed, right? All this, or surveilled, excuse me. But
Hmm.
the uh those kinds of ways of reading culture, and the Gothic is, so good at slightly or thinly allegorizing reality, right? And when we
Yeah.
feel like we can't say what we want to say, then the Gothic gives us a way to tell our story when it cannot be told so literally, so explicitly, right? But it then is recorded.
Wow. I mean, bravo. Like, present that, Amy, write that.
Well, it's not me.
But
I'm just, it's what it does, right? The Gothic is
well,
incredible in that way.
and I
Yeah.
think that, like, as we're nearing part two of Wicked coming out, and I got to talk with Gregory Maguire on the podcast two times actually, and um, I always find the text so fascinating, and I think it speaks so much. Like, yes, The Wizard of Oz is such an origin American like fairy tale, but I also think that the political elements of like the person Alphaba being seen as the monster, as a witch, wicked, like the monstrosity of her speaking her truth, her authenticity, that she's going to out the wizard as, a man without any power, that he's trying to exert like authoritarian control. I mean, there's such a theme of like dictatorship happening in this text, in this musical. And it makes sense why it's speaking so much to our current moment is people feel like they don't have a voice to um, you know, have governmental representation. And like if anything, it feels like the government is actually trying to squash anyone who resists. And yeah, I agree with you. I think that like that's our current anxieties. And I think it's also, how do you break the spell? And I said this in another episode, but how do you break the spell of this like cult brainwash thinking where you can present all the facts you want, but people have convinced themselves that they are the only ones who are correct. And it doesn't matter what you present them with, because if you question them, you're questioning who they are, and that means that they then don't have any more power. Like it really feels like that's what's happening right now. I mean, I don't know if you feel or see that, and I just feel like it is so connected to Gothic literature.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, yeah, I see that, I feel that, we're witnessing it, right? And because at least I would speak for myself, I'm in a fairly privileged position right now. Those encroachments haven't quite reached me, but the chilling effect is here. And so it's, and the Gothic speaks to those things about who wants to have power, who wants to control others, who wants to hide others in their dungeons and confine them and get them out of the way and stop them
Mhm.
from being heard, stop them from speaking, right? Stop them from correcting the record to being that proof, that repressed that comes back, right? The return of the repressed. So as we keep trying to deny who we are and what we're doing, the Gothic is the perfect vehicle to say that there will be a price we pay for that, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that it'll be so interesting to see what is being created right now, what gets approved. I'm
Right,
just very
right.
curious to see, what
Mhm.
Hollywood backs, like what is able to get funding in this current moment.
Right, right.
And like, are we going to like, rely on like literature even more because like there's more of a creative voice where authors do get published more so than say a big budget Hollywood film, or you're kind of seeking that underground network of like podcasts or of like those who are, talking and conversing, but maybe aren't on the public stage, if that makes sense.
Right, or even just our independent presses, our independent
Hmm.
films, right, where they're able to get, they have always been doing important work, but particularly in moments like the one we're facing, I think, right? And this idea of, you're right, you can't just talk to people without them sometimes feeling like you're attacking them, but the power of story, that can be a way in, right? That's what is so important with what we see in film and TV series, in songs, and in, of
Yeah,
course, novels, short stories, poetry, plays. I mean, they can do
absolutely.
that. They can do that work little by little. They can shape how we view the world, for the better, hopefully, for the better.
Absolutely. And to kind of tee up a future episode, I'm doing a Hocus Pocus episode with
Oh,
an author who just did an oral narrative history with like the cast, the crew, the creative team. And
oh,
you're making me
cool.
think of like there's a new book that I know it's for the Gothic book club that I hope to join called I Tituba, like the,
Mhm.
you know, woman of color in Salem
Yeah, yeah.
who, right, like
Mhm.
has been seen as like Stacy Schiff's The Witches kind of brought to bear, oh, maybe like, the history of Tituba that like was there a demonizing of her that like caused this whole mass hysteria? I mean, the Salem witch trials have a lot of different origin histories of what happened. Like some might think they were eating a bad crop and then they just like got
Yes,
hallucinations.
yeah, the
But
hallucinogenic thing.
the
Yes.
hallucinogenic theory. But I even think with Hocus Pocus, how about if Hocus Pocus actually, like the Sanderson sisters, one of them, like Tituba, was part of the group? Like that would be a
Mhm.
very different film.
Yes, for
And
sure.
it
A
is
good one. That'd be
interesting,
fascinating. Yes, you need to pitch
right?
that.
Yes, I think we need a
Yeah.
Tituba film. I think that
Oh,
would
sure.
be, yeah, important. But Amy, this has been wonderful. I love everything, you do. I'm so grateful to call you like a colleague in the Poe field in 19th century
And a
literature
friend. And a
and a
friend, of course.
friend and a friend.
Yes,
And
great to be
I want
friends.
everyone to look up More Than Love and endure the enduring fascination with Edgar Allan Poe. So where, Amy, can everyone, find your work or get their
Yeah.
hands on your work?
So for this book, it's published by Mercer University Press. Highly recommend that press. They were great to work with. But of course, you can find it on Amazon. So
Mm.
if you'd like to order it there, that's perfectly fine too. And yeah, it's a great book. It has 20 chapters. The conceit for the book was approaching people who have been directly influenced in their jobs by Poe, and so by Edgar Allan Poe. So it might be that they're holding a job he had, like a poet or a horror short story writer, or they're in a field that tends to adapt him, like film or music. Also, we have a curator from the Poe Museum. We have some historical interpreters, so people who go out as Poe. And the book opens with a chapter by a docent at Westminster. So it gives the
Oh,
tours
wow.
of the gravesite, and so it tells their stories about how they encountered Poe, and then just how he's become a big part of their lives. So yeah, it was really fun to put together. In Poe studies, the scholars often talk about pop culture, but we don't usually invite the people who make sure Poe is out there in pop culture to talk about it. So that's what I wanted to do with this book, have their voices heard. And it was just a really gratifying experience.
Well, thank you for giving them voice, Amy. I think it's such an important book. I love all of the essays that, are represented with all of these various, Poe inspired people.
Mhm.
And It's been such a pleasure having you on, and I can't wait to have you back again. We'll figure out another, maybe next year there'll be something that comes out that we have to talk about together.
Yes. Or we'll circle back to the movie is called Crimson Peak. Is that right?
Crimson Peak. Yes, yes.
So we'll see. We'll maybe talk about some movies, some older ones.
I would love that. I would love that. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Amy. This was so fun.
Thank you. I had fun too. Happy Halloween and Poe evermore.
Yes.